Hi everyone, Ahmad Sadiq here from Land Trust Title of Central Florida. Let's talk title. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking today about dealing with a transaction where there's an ongoing escrow dispute. Ultimately, what this means is, as a listing agent, you're working with the seller, there's a first contract, goes under contract, buyer pulls out, or there's some kind of a disagreement, and the buyer ultimately walks away. And the seller refuses to release those escrow funds back to the buyer, but also then wants to go under contract with a second buyer. Underwriters are generally going to require that there is an effective release and cancellation of that first contract. And the reason for that is, as long as the seller is holding escrow funds that the buyer previously put into the escrow account, the buyer still has some type of an interest in the property. And the reason for that is, even if a buyer is defaulted on some aspect of the contract, a default of the contract is not the same thing as a cancellation of a contract. Someone can be in default of a contract and still have some rights, some interest in the property. So in a situation where a seller has held on to escrow funds from an initial buyer, then has gone under contract with another buyer, in order for that second contract to close, that first contract has to be properly released and canceled. So that means that there's some kind of an escrow dispute that says specifically the buyer from the first transaction has no interest in closing on the transaction, and that the only thing that they're debating is how much, if any, of those escrow funds the seller can keep, or the escrow funds have to be returned to the buyer and the contract has to be effectively canceled using a release and cancellation or some other contractual means that shows the title company that the buyer from the first contract has no interest in the property whatsoever, because the last thing you want is to close the second transaction and the buyer from the first transaction come back and say, listen, I still have an interest on this property because you still have my escrow funds and I wish to close on it. And we're in a situation now where the property's already been transferred from the seller to the second buyer. It just becomes a very messy, hairy situation. If you're a listing agent and you're working with a seller that is still holding on to funds from an initial transaction, you want to have them have a conversation with the title company or with a real estate attorney about what the potential consequences are of holding on to those escrow funds and trying to close on the second transaction, because it can get a little bit messy. Again, guys, thank you so much for your time. I'll see you next time.